All right. Welcome everyone to today's Cardano Foundation seminar. We have a very exciting topic today, and that's Cardano P2P-DeFi. We're joined today by Perry, Jerry, and Rusty from the P2P-DeFi team. They will share with us what they have been building and what P2P-DeFi even means. It's for maybe some of you not a novel concept, but for some of you probably it is. And one thing I also want to highlight, there will be room for questions throughout the presentation. So there will be slots where you then will be able to ask questions. And in the meantime, you can either put them in the chat, or when that time comes, just raise your hand and I will call on you. And without any further ado, I will hand over the mic to Rusty. Thank you so much, first of all, for being here. And I'm really excited to learn more about P2P-DeFi. Thank you.
Thanks for having me. Can everybody hear me okay?
You're loud and clear.
Okay. So hello, everyone. I'm fallen-icarus, but you can call me Rusty. This seminar, as was stated, is about the P2P-DeFi protocols. However, what I'm working on is actually much bigger than just the protocols. If I had to explain what I'm doing in one sentence, it would be, I'm trying to help Cardano reach its full potential by rebuilding its DeFi from the ground up. I say rebuilding and not fixing or changing because I truly believe we need to stop the current DeFi and start over. It's overly expensive, it doesn't scale well, it has liquidity issues, and it centralizes delegation. But DeFi doesn't have to be this way. The P2P-DeFi protocols were designed to solve all four problems. The first three problems actually have the same root cause. DeFi is being approached from the wrong perspective. This incorrect perspective is sending DeFi down the wrong path. Blockchain was invented to manage money. DeFi stands for decentralized finance. Yet economic principles are not being applied to Cardano's DeFi. We can't just think like programmers. We also need to think like economists. If we did, the first three issues would naturally fix themselves. There are two areas where economic principles need to be applied. The first is in how DeFi dApps integrate features. They are currently being designed as all-in-one dApps, where all features are built directly into the dApp. But this isn't how TradFi markets are designed. TradFi markets are designed using layers, and there are good reasons for this. Using layers has huge advantages over the all-in-one approach. The second area where we need to apply economic principles is UTXO contention. DeFi is currently using batchers everywhere to address this. But in economics, limited resources are managed by free markets. When it comes to DeFi, we should be using free markets to address UTXO contention. Applying economic principles to these two areas is enough to solve all three problems. The last problem has nothing to do with economic principles, but it still needs to be solved to stop Cardano's DeFi from destroying it from the inside. Centralizing delegation directly undermines the security of Ouroboros and Cardano's new government. The solution is to use a distributed dApp design. Currently, most dApps have users share a single smart contract address. I'm calling these concentrated dApps because the assets are concentrated in this address. But in distributed dApps, all users get their own smart contract address. This lets users keep delegation control of any assets inside their smart contract address. With that last piece of the puzzle, all four problems are solved. As you can see, there's a lot to cover in this seminar, so if you have questions, I'll be stopping at different points to answer them. Let's jump right into applying economic principles. Broadly speaking, of the three problems solved by them, cost and scale are solved by switching from an all-in-one dApp design to a layering design. The liquidity issues are solved by using free markets for UTXO contention. We will cover the all-in-one versus layering first. I want to make sure everyone knows what I mean by all-in-one dApp. As I said, it is a dApp that has all useful features built directly into it. So if the dApp was a DEX, it would have high throughput, liquidity, instant settlement, best price enforcement, and censorship resistance. It is meant to be a single application that serves everyone. It's used directly by both end users and businesses. But this isn't how TradFi works. TradFi has all of the features end users like, but it supports them using a layered approach. It has an extremely simple layer 1 with fancy layer 2 entities built on top, and users interact with the market through the layer 2 entities. The example here is a TradFi order book. Layer 1 is a US-based private company called the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, or DTCC for short. All it does is update account balances whenever a trade is executed. And even though it is a US-based company, it actually handles settlement for most of the world. Every year, it settles quadrillions of dollars worth of trades. But again, all it does is update account balances whenever a trade is executed. It does not have liquidity services. It takes 2 days for trades to settle, and it does not have best price enforcement. Despite that, the entities built on top of the DTCC do have liquidity services, trades settle instantly, and they do have best price enforcement. The layer 2 entities specialize and work together to support the features end users like. For example, brokers like Fidelity typically rely on external market makers to provide liquidity for their users. This approach is very similar to the Linux kernel approach. The DTCC is effectively the financial kernel for TradFi order books, and the layer 2 entities are the GUIs and other helpful tools built on top. The Linux kernel doesn't try to do everything. It leaves a lot to the software built on top. DeFi should take TradFi's layering approach and improve upon it. We can replace the DTCC at layer 1 with a DeFi protocol. If the DTCC is just updating account balances whenever a trade is executed, that can be fully automated. Cardano Swaps is the P2P-DeFi protocol. It was designed to replace the DTCC. As the simplicity of the DTCC shows, Cardano Swaps does not need to support fancy features, and it doesn't need to be fast. It can rely on businesses and blockchain layer 2s to supplement the missing features and throughput. Delta DeFi is a specialized Hydra channel for high-frequency trading that occasionally settles against centralized exchanges like Binance and Coinbase. It can be updated so that it also settles against Cardano Swaps. Before we compare the all-in-one approach to layering, there is one point that is implied in this diagram, but I want to make it explicit because it is crucially important for understanding why layering is so much better. Ask yourself this: in this diagram, where is each feature supported? An easy one is high throughput. I just said it. High throughput is supported by Delta DeFi. The layer 1 doesn't have high throughput, and neither does Fidelity or the market maker. Fidelity and the market maker have better throughput than layer 1, but they aren't meant for day trading, so their throughput likely isn't as high as Delta DeFi's. To put some numbers on it, perhaps layer 1 is at 1x speed, Fidelity is at 2x speed, and Delta DeFi is at 10x speed. Now, what about censorship resistance? Delta DeFi sacrificed it in order to achieve its high throughput, so it's not there. Fidelity and the market maker also sacrificed some censorship resistance in order to be as fast as they are, so they only have some. Layer 1 is where the highest censorship resistance is found. Users that prioritize high throughput can use Delta DeFi, while users that prioritize censorship resistance can use layer 1 directly. And users that fall somewhere in between can use Fidelity. Here is the key takeaway. Both layer 1 and the layer 2 entities specialize to satisfy specific niches. As a result, the layering approach isolates features from each other. Users go to wherever their desired features are supported. This is why there is no need for the layer 1 to support high throughput. Now let's do the side-by-side comparison. First, we will compare all-in-one versus layering based on how well they scale, and then we will compare them based on cost. The all-in-one approach means all features are supported on a single layer. They aren't isolated from each other. This is the heart of its scaling problems. The blockchain trilemma says you can't have censorship resistance and high throughput. If the all-in-one dApp tries to increase throughput, it is forced to sacrifice some censorship resistance. If it keeps going, it will end up sacrificing all of its censorship resistance. The users that prefer censorship resistance now have nowhere to go. They were effectively sacrificed for the users that prefer high throughput. The layering approach doesn't have this problem precisely because the features can be isolated from each other. It can be scaled without sacrificing users. For example, Delta DeFi can go from 10x speed to 20x speed without impacting the rest of the ecosystem. This is an extremely important point, especially when comparing blockchains like Cardano and Solana. The layering approach is able to satisfy more niches overall because it doesn't have to sacrifice niches as it scales up. Cardano's got the right idea with its layering approach, but the same principles also apply to DeFi. Before moving on to the cost comparison, I want to point out that this has knock-on effects for liquidity. Let's go back to this slide. Since Charlie and Business B are no longer being satisfied by the DEX, they have no reason to continue providing liquidity to it. How much liquidity do you think they were contributing? Let me rephrase the question to get at the core concept. Do entities with a lot of wealth typically prefer high throughput or high censorship resistance? Examples of wealthy entities are high net worth individuals, central banks, large corporations, mutual funds, and pension funds. High net worth individuals might prefer high throughput, but the other four definitely don't day trade. Why would they care about high throughput? As long as the market has enough liquidity for them, they will most likely prefer censorship resistance. So by sacrificing censorship resistance, even though only a few users were sacrificed, a huge chunk of the DEX's liquidity could have been sacrificed. That means as the all-in-one dApp tries to scale, its liquidity problems are going to get worse. To sum up this section, when it comes to scaling, layering is the clear winner because it doesn't sacrifice any niches as it scales. Now, what about cost? By cost, I mean, how much will users have to pay to use DeFi? Cost is directly tied to how efficient something is. In other words, the more optimized features can be, the cheaper those features will be for end users. So which approach is easier to optimize? As I explained while comparing scaling, the all-in-one dApp can't increase throughput without sacrificing some of its other features. That means it can't fully optimize its throughput. It needs to find a balance across all of its supported features. It's hard enough to balance just 2 features, but the all-in-one approach needs to balance all features. Layering doesn't have this problem, again, because it isolates features. Certain features can be optimized while leaving others alone. What I'm describing here is the economic principle called division of labor that Adam Smith talked about in his book, The Wealth of Nations. Specialized entities that work together can produce the same features for significantly less cost. Layering will always be cheaper. So once again, the clear winner of this comparison is layering. Does anyone have any questions on this? We'll be talking about UTXO contention next. If not, we can just keep going.
Yes, there is a question from Mateusz. Go ahead.
Hey, I appreciate it a lot, what you are doing. Just first of all, the question is, why do you think Cardano DeFi, considering that we have a unique UTXO model, why do you think it went in the direction of non-P2P in a standard, well, let's call it a standard way, like closer to Ethereum, like with smart contracts where the liquidity is locked, contended, and stuff like that? Thank you.
I think it's because Ethereum came first. It's just an accident of history in a way. Like they chose the account model. Then when Cardano came out with smart contracts, everybody's rushing to be first mover because there's first mover advantage. It's faster to copy paste something that already exists than to come up with something completely new. That's why. It's much harder to start from scratch and try to figure out what's best for the extended UTXO model. If you want to launch a dApp in 6 months, you're going to copy Ethereum.
But thank you. But is it the only reason, or commercially the P2P model is less maybe appealing? There could be more reasons, right?
You'll actually see in the next section that that's not true. It's a misconception. People are misusing the extended UTXO model.
If I could just add to that, I think there's just like a higher activation energy. So when you say the peer-to-peer DeFi model is less commercially viable, to an extent, that's true in the same way that the Linux kernel is not commercially viable until people start building on top of it. So getting it up off the ground, if it is the best thing for the UTXO model, there's no token here. There's no way to profit directly the same way that any other DeFi protocol with a token is. So there's a higher kind of bar to get it going. And so I think that's another reason why it hasn't taken off yet.
Just to be clear, I didn't suggest. I didn't say that it was. I only asked the question because I actually don't know. It was a question. Just to be clear.
When we at the end, if you still have questions, then ask again, because I'm going to cover a lot more that builds on that.
Appreciate it. The next question is from Alexandra. Alexandra, go ahead.
Hello. This might be a stupid question. I joined in like 5 minutes late, but when you're talking about, Cardano swaps at the layer 1, are you talking about a dApp that is built on the layer 1 or a layer 1 platform? So then
It's a dApp. It's a set of smart contracts that are built on the layer 1.
Okay, so then that would be considered a layer 2, and what's considered a layer 2 in your diagram, the Hydra channels, that would be a layer 3, if we're thinking that the layer 1 is Cardano?
Well, the smart contracts are running on Cardano, so I would call them layer 1. Maybe that's a semantic thing. Like Hydra, in my opinion, is separate from Cardano. It's a sidechain layer 2. Like smart contracts that run on Cardano, in my opinion, are layer 1.
Okay, cool. I was just finding that a little bit confusing, but thanks for the clarification.
I think we also talk about like layers and functionality when we say layer 2. So for example, a DEX could act, right? You have a Hydra head type of DEX. There are regular DEXs that could interact with the layer. This is meant to be more of a protocol, we think, at the base layer versus, and then, as it says, like individual entities, DEXs, lending protocols can all interact with it as a need to, and they still might have a set of user bases or user base as well. So,
we'll take one more question, but then I want to move on because I want to make sure I cover everything.
Absolutely. Denisio, go ahead and be brief.
Thanks, Nicholas, and thanks, by the way, also for the explanation. In the beginning, you said that this all needs to be reshaped, redone, etc. Right? And you said to do this, we need to start thinking like economists. Maybe I'm a little bit ahead, but within the team, are there any economists really helping with this? Because surely there has to be someone guiding this from such perspective, or not?
So my perspective is actually, or my background is actually mostly economist and economics. I taught myself to code only recently because I was extremely frustrated with what was being built. That pretty much sums it up why I'm doing this.
Thanks. Clear.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we'll move on. There'll be another gap for another Q&A session. Okay, so we've covered how layering helps with the first two issues and how layering can protect the current liquidity while it scales up, but we still want more liquidity overall. For that, we need to switch our focus to UTXO contention. UTXO contention comes from the fact that UTXOs can only be used once. Sometimes users are able to share a UTXO, but when you are dealing with strangers from all over the world, sharing is difficult. So the fear is that if left to their own devices, users will end up racing each other to use UTXOs, and UTXOs will almost never be shared. This would create a terrible user experience, and UTXOs would be inefficiently used. The ecosystem's current solution to this is batchers. Users line up to be grouped together by the batchers. Nobody is allowed to interact with the UTXOs directly. It's ironic, DeFi is meant to eliminate middlemen, yet Cardano's current DeFi decided it was a good idea to mandate new ones. Instead of walling off UTXOs behind batchers, we should open up access to everyone and let free markets take over. As you'll see, this will have two consequences. The first is that users will be able to pay up to get exclusive access to UTXOs. Forcing users to always share UTXOs is actually bad. It's holding back Cardano's DeFi. The second is that batchers will be forced to compete against each other. Currently, batcher fees are hard-coded, and changes require slow governance actions. If batchers compete, fees will change dynamically with supply and demand. And as a result, batcher fees will likely be a lot lower than they are today. For both consequences, we are going to look at a DeFi order book. Order books are the poster child for UTXO contention, but everything you've probably heard about them is false. They've only struggled because we haven't been applying economic principles to them. When we do, a DeFi order book becomes the heart of the whole DeFi ecosystem. This is not an exaggeration. We're going to use the JED ADA trading pair because it's easier for me to say 95 cents per ADA than 0.95 JED per ADA. Decimals are pretty annoying to say. And in case you're new to order books, sellers and their asking prices are found on top, while buyers are found on the bottom with their bid prices. Okay, most people believe the demand on an order book looks like this. Only the lowest ask and the highest bid have demand. But this is only true in TradFi. In DeFi, when anyone can interact with the open orders directly, you can choose any order you want. You could choose the best priced order, but you could also choose the worst priced order. If you chose the worst priced order, you would probably be the only person in the whole world trying to use that order. Where's the UTXO contention in this scenario? This extreme example highlights the core concept. There is a huge spectrum of orders between the best price and the worst price. You don't have to go all the way to the worst price just to get a UTXO to yourself. Here is a table that highlights the main idea. If you pay up 1%, you might be competing with the majority of other users and bots, so your transaction success rate is probably pretty low. But what if you paid up 3%? That might be enough for you to have the whole UTXO to yourself. Your transaction success rate jumps to almost 100%. Now, you're probably asking yourself why someone would ever want to pay up for a swap. Imagine you see an NFT you want on sale for 100 ADA, but you currently only have JET. You're expecting a market correction, so you convert in most of your ADA to JET. What's the best way for you to try buying this NFT? With the current DeFi, you only have one option. You need to use two separate transactions. You'll convert some JET to ADA in one transaction, and then try to buy the NFT in another transaction. What if the NFT is purchased by someone else after your first transaction, but before your second one? You would need to rush to convert your ADA back to JED before the market corrects. The best case scenario is you wasted the fees for two transactions. But the worst case scenario is you get caught in the market correction and end up with less JED than when you started. We are all painfully aware of how wild crypto price swings can be. You could easily lose 20% while trying to buy this NFT. This situation sucks. But if you can interact with the order book UTXOs directly, another option becomes possible. You could use only one transaction. You'll try to convert the JED to ADA and buy the NFT in the same transaction. If the NFT is purchased by someone else, your JED will never be converted to ADA. It either gets converted and used immediately or not at all. And if this transaction fails, it costs you nothing. You only pay fees if the purchase is successful. Let's go back to this table. Would you pay up on the swap in this scenario? If you don't, it would be a miracle for your 2-in-1 transaction to go through. So how badly do you want the NFT? You can either pay up 3% on the swap to do the 2-in-1 transaction, or you could risk losing 20% with separate transactions. Which would you rather? Behavioral economics has shown that people would rather take a guaranteed small loss now than risk a major loss later. The whole insurance industry is literally based on this idea. You pay a small monthly premium so that if disaster strikes, you don't take a large loss later. So even if you personally wouldn't, most people will rather pay up the 3% for the 2-in-1 approach. That means the actual demand on a DeFi order book looks like this. It's highest near the market price, but drops off exponentially as you move further away. This is only possible if UTXO contention is managed by free markets. Before moving on to the next free market consequence, I need to emphasize what this 2-in-1 transaction enables. When I said the DeFi order book is the heart of DeFi, it's because of this 2-in-1 transaction. There are 3 things that make this 2-in-1 transaction special. Each reason by itself is a DeFi game changer, but we get all 3 if we use free markets. The first is that it makes all native assets fungible with all other native assets for a small fee. The second is that it eliminates a lot of DeFi risk. And the third is that it enables dApps to share the liquidity on the order book. Let's go through them one at a time. If this 2-in-1 transaction actually goes through, at a transaction level, you used JED to purchase an NFT that was priced in ADA. In other words, by paying a small 3% conversion fee, you made JED and ADA fungible. This is amazing. Consider stablecoins. Stablecoin liquidity is currently fractured across all of the different stablecoins. You can't use JED to pay back a loan in USDM. The 2-in-1 transaction fixes that. As for risk, by agreeing to pay an extra 3% for the swap, you completely eliminated the 20% risk from the impending market correction. And remember, if the 2-in-1 transaction fails, it costs you nothing. Paying the 3% eliminated all failure risks. Corporations have entire departments dedicated to risk management. If they can protect themselves against excessive risk like this, they will be more willing to hold Cardano native assets and participate in DeFi. That's a pretty big deal. Finally, liquidity sharing means dApps don't need their own liquidity sources. The NFT marketplace didn't need its own liquidity source for you to buy the NFT with Jet. You were able to get the liquidity you needed from the order book. Liquidity sharing opens the door to so many other P2P DeFi markets. If a borrower needs to make a loan payment in JED but only has USDM, they could convert JED to USDM and make the loan payment in the same transaction. There is no need for the lending dApp to have its own liquidity source. If you see an options contract for sale in ADA, but you only have JED, you can use the 2-in-1 transaction, just like with the NFT purchase. As a result, the options trading dApp also doesn't need its own liquidity source. Liquidity sharing means new dApps can be launched without having to bootstrap their own liquidity. Bootstrapping liquidity is the hardest part of launching new dApps. Sharing eliminates that obstacle and also eliminates the sideload liquidity problem. The order book is effectively a single blockchain-wide source of liquidity. That's why I call the order book the heart of DeFi. But again, we only get all of this if we use free markets to handle UTXO contention. We've now talked about the first consequence. Let's move on to the second one. How to make batchers compete against each other. We want batchers to compete because it will drive down their fees. They are artificially high right now. The concept is pretty simple. Because the order book is fully open, bots are constantly scanning the open orders, looking for arbitrage opportunities. We can take advantage of this behavior and make these bots act like batchers. Let's say you want to buy 100 ADA at 87 cents per ADA. You don't need to immediately use the ADA for anything, so you are willing to wait for the conversion. The lowest ask has 1,226 ADA, which is plenty for you. You just need to get around the UTXO contention. To do it, create an order to buy 100 ADA with a price that is higher than 87 cents per ADA. This will create a negative spread for the order book. A negative spread is an arbitrage opportunity. Bots will compete to match your bid against the ask at 87 cents per ADA. Whichever bot does will get to keep the entire spread amount. So the larger the overlap you create, the more bots will compete to fulfill your order. This table gives some estimates of what you might expect. Bots still want to make a profit, so the revenue needs to be higher than the transaction fee. If you only offer a 0.1% overlap for the 100 ADA trade, that's only 0.1 ADA for the bot. Based on my benchmarking with the P2P DEX protocol, the transaction fee is about 0.2 ADA. So your order can't be filled by itself. It needs to be batched with other orders for the bot to make a profit. Finding a good batch could take a few hours. But if you created a 0.5% overlap, that's 0.5 ADA for the bot. The transaction fee for the bot is still only 0.2 ADA, which means your order can be filled by itself. It could take only a few minutes this time. So as this example highlights, the greater the overlap you create, the faster your order will be fulfilled. Just a quick side note, some people have commented that creating negative spreads is a bad user experience. I want to remind you that UTXO contention is only relevant for entities using the layer 1 directly. If an end user is interacting with the market through a layer 2 entity, they will never have to worry about UTXO contention. But layer 2 entities themselves do have to worry about it. Have you ever wondered who's the market maker for market makers? There isn't one. The negative spread approach is meant for the players who need to use layer 1 directly, but don't want to pay up for exclusive access to a UTXO. Everyone else can stay blissfully ignorant of this annoyance. We've now discussed both consequences of using free markets for UTXO contention, but how does any of this help with liquidity? The answer comes from the 2-in-1 transaction. It dramatically increases the incentives for liquidity providers. Consider this basically empty order book. If you need to use a 2-in-1 transaction, you would have to pay up 5% to use the ask at 91 cents per ADA. Now, if I see this, I'm going to deliberately create a limit order at 3% above the market price. Why would I do this? Well, if you use my limit order for your 2-in-1 transaction, I get to keep the entire 3% revenue. If you have the choice between paying up 5% or only 3%, you're going to choose 3%, which means my limit order. This is passive income for me. I have no intention of trading myself, but by populating the order book at strategic positions, I can get paid whenever people use 2-in-1 transactions. As I said, the 2-in-1 transaction is actually awesome, so people will use it. Unfortunately, I just told you my secret. Some of you may want passive income too. To attract people to use your limit orders instead of mine, you could create a limit order at 1% above the current price. Now people will prefer your limit orders. The key idea here is that there is no revenue sharing, so liquidity providers are forced to compete against each other. If I want to keep making passive income, I need to make another limit order at 1% or create one at 0.5%. Since I'm only trying to provide liquidity for 2-in-1 transactions, I need to factor in market volatility. If I set my order at 0.5% and the prices move by 0.5%, my limit order will be executed at the wrong time. So I'll actually prefer making another limit order at 1%. I'd rather a 50-50 chance of making passive income than take the risk of market volatility. As this example highlights, the demand for 2-in-1 transactions combines with liquidity provider competition to create incentives for the entire order book. Current DeFi order books are so focused on providing liquidity at the market price that they neglect the incentives everywhere else. This is actually counterproductive because in order for market makers to provide liquidity at the market price, they need liquidity to already exist on the order book above the market price. Providing liquidity to order books that look like this is too risky for them. Market makers always want to reverse their trades as quickly as possible. If there is no user ready on the other side, the market maker may want to trade against an open order, but this order book may not always have an open order available. Market makers prefer this kind of order book. We've covered a lot, so I want to do a quick summary of how free markets help with DeFi liquidity. By using free markets for UTXO contention, we unlock the 2-in-1 transaction. The 2-in-1 transaction is literally a DeFi game changer. All native assets become fungible for a slight fee. A huge amount of DeFi risk is eliminated. And dApps share liquidity. The demand for these 2-in-1 transactions dramatically increases the incentives to provide liquidity on the DeFi order book. With all that in mind, when deciding whether to handle UTXO contention with batchers or free markets, the 2-in-1 transaction heavily skews the choice in favor of free markets. It's one of the main reasons why I think Cardano's DeFi will eventually be number one. The account model is too expensive to support 2-in-1 transactions. Those blockchains are seriously missing out. We could stop for questions again. Does anybody have questions on this section?
Yes, I actually have a question, and maybe it's a really quick one, but if the initial order book doesn't have enough liquidity in it, so to say, right, would that concept still work, or is it like a chicken and egg thing where, you know, if no one starts filling up the order book, this can never get started in a way? Do you know what I mean?
It's not a chicken or egg, it's just a very slow grassroots process. So it could be that there's only one order book that everybody's using. So the P2P-DEX protocol supports all native assets, all trading pairs, but maybe people currently only care about ADA and JET. So initially it just starts there. But it's like Bitcoin started with like 10 people passing around for free Bitcoin. It's kind of going to start something similar where you'll have 20 users. And then maybe those 20 users, some of them are using the credit market P2P-DeFi protocol, and they're doing the 2-in-1 transaction there. So as long as you don't only integrate the DEX, you integrate it with one of the other P2P-DeFi protocols, you have the 2-in-1 transaction, and it just builds from there.
The one thing to add there is that there's the incentivization, right? Those are arbitrage opportunities that any user, whether it's an end user or a DEX, can post, say, a snake order on book, right? It's just an order. It's an intent, something they want to get filled, right? People will start looking. There are revenue opportunities when you start seeing these type of orders for market makers to come in. And again, the order book is completely permissionless, so anyone can go act as a market maker on top of this.
Thank you. We have a few hands up. Mateusz, go ahead. You were the first.
I have two questions, but first question might be a bit stupid, so please bear with me. Don't kill a novice DeFi person, like comparing to you professionals. So we had a lot of hype for the AXO, for the order book DEX. We had a lot of hype for the Genius Yield, and I believe they are both live, but they are not enormously successful, at least from what I heard. Maybe I'm wrong. So I would like to ask you the question: why do you think like that? Why do you think it is? And also related to the first question is, isn't it that sometimes with the order book model, we have a problem that users simply do not understand the game theory, so they will go for the 1%, well, for the middle of the funnel, which basically causes the contention exactly. And the second question is your protocol live, the P2P-DeFi? How can I interact with it today as a user? Thank you.
So the first question, Axo and Genius, they're both struggling because they've closed off their order book behind batchers. Genius doesn't call them batchers, they call them smart order routers, but they make it really hard to actually pay up for UTXO directly. And because of that, they don't support the 2-in-1 transaction. They don't share their liquidity, and therefore their order books don't get paid when the order book shares its liquidity. So that's why they're struggling. They are missing a huge portion of the incentives to provide liquidity on the order book. The second question, I forgot the second question, but real quick for the third question, is this live already? Yes, they're already live. They're currently on testnet right now, and they're currently in the process of getting audited. What was your second question again?
My second question was related to the fact that I see that a lot of novice users are
choosing the 1%, right?
Either choosing 1% or they will accidentally go for the end of the funnel, which is the worst basically, and then they get wrecked on a swap completely. We had a few tweets like that from people.
So that is a one, an education problem. Like professionals are most likely going to be doing the 2-in-1 for the most part, and two, a UI problem, the wallets. It's their job to make it easy to understand what they're doing. Like I actually did create a demo, which like I'll give a link to later. It's actually not that hard to show people how to use it safely. So it's people just have to. It's a different way of thinking, but it's really not that hard. Next question.
Well, I want to quickly add in to answer that first question about like Axos and Genius. They like this protocol is somewhat very similar to how Axos has built it, but Axos chose the all-in-one DEX, right? They locked it away. They are the only market maker on their order book. We are suggesting to create an order book that's across the entire Cardano ecosystem, similar to you might have seen with Serum on Solana, but like right in an actual DeFi, decentralized and permissionless way where there's no token or anything like that. So right there's some big. We're not thinking of this as a DEX. It's a protocol that supports everyone on top of it. And end users stands a second. End users probably might just work directly with the market maker. You don't always need, they can just go to Delta DeFi or Hydra Head and go back and forth. But for example, back to Rusty's point, there'll be at some point they traded a bunch of Snake with a user, right? Delta DeFi did, for example. They want to get out of Snake at some point. Well, what are they going to do? There's no, where does the DEX or the market maker go to trade? Well, it's down here at, on the actual, at the layer 1 order book and liquidity layer.
Okay. We have time for, I think there's 2 more, at least that I see.
Mathieu, go ahead.
Yes. Thank you for the presentation. It's quite clear. I actually had an example today. So we say, for example, you mentioned stablecoins. Today we have stablecoins that have different properties. For example, USDM is a stablecoin with backed by USD, and the JED is algorithmic, and they fluctuate. So today, for example, I had a limit order for 1% exchange, and it didn't trigger because I made the limit order on a pool that didn't have enough liquidity to trigger the order, which is super annoying because it's not my intent. My intent is to fix the 1% difference, and whoever in the market can feel it, I'm fine with it. I don't care, and that's a use case that will be perfectly handled by Cardano swaps. So yeah, I'm hoping it comes sooner rather than later. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. This makes a lot of sense to me. So essentially what you're saying is that the order book should be entirely open and anyone can pick up an order and fulfill it if they want to. This makes a lot of sense to me. I have one question, or I didn't quite catch, unfortunately, this concept of the 2-in-1 transaction. So like an order in the order book, I'm willing to exchange so many DED for so and so many ADA. That would be a single UTXO. How would you do this 2-in-1 transaction? Is it simply a wallet that takes two of those, or simply a single Cardano transaction that takes two of those UTXOs and does something else with them?
So you actually have to create a transaction cart, like an online shopping cart, where you basically add actions like you want to execute this limit order, you want to take like 10 ADA from the 100 ADA available, that goes into your transaction cart. It's not ready to be built yet and submitted. You now go to the NFT marketplace, you see the NFT sale itself is another UTXO. You just click, I want to buy that too, that goes into the cart. And now you just need to finish balancing the cart. The cart puts it all together into a single transaction and you sign and submit that to the network. So it implies there's a transaction cart.
Yeah. So and as far as the underlying technology on the Cardano blockchain goes, essentially what this transaction card essentially amounts to is a single transaction, in the sense of something, a seaboard that is accepted by the ledger. So this would be mostly about the user interface on how to make that transaction, because like it's not your UTXO, it's not your keys, it's a smart contract. You have to combine them somewhere. No other wallet can do it at the moment.
Correct.
All right, thank you.
And just Matthias, the one you said, right? It would have been great if that DEX, right? You were interacting with that pool and you gave an order that was too big. That DEX could then say, well, I want to fill this in full. I don't have all liquidity. They can go to the bottom or, down to the layer 1 Cardano swaps and say, well, I can do this 500. I need 500 more. And someone else can fulfill that. So then they can fulfill theirs, right? This is how liquidity gets shared and how dApps don't need their own liquidity sources.
Okay, I want to move on to make sure there's one more section and then we can spend the rest of the time on the rest of the questions. We've now finished with the economic principles. Let's now move on to the centralized delegation problem. As I said in the very beginning, we are mostly using concentrated dApps and need to switch to distributed dApps. Switching will also help with liquidity since some larger entities don't like the idea of giving up delegation control. If I had 1 million ADA, I wouldn't want to give that much delegation power to dApp developers. So I'd end up keeping most of my ADA out of DeFi. The core idea behind concentrated versus distributed dApps is, where do users interact? Do they have to go to a central marketplace to interact, or can they interact from the comfort of their own homes? Concentrated dApps are like the central marketplace. Users must come out to a central location to interact. This central marketplace is a shared smart contract address. Any assets that need to be locked up are locked up inside this shared smart contract address. Since Cardano's delegation is by address, using a shared address is a problem. When people say DeFi centralizes proof-of-stake blockchains, they are referring to this shared address problem. But this isn't actually an issue with DeFi. It's just an issue with concentrated dApps. Distributed dApps don't have this problem. Distributed dApps are like everyone interacting from the comfort of their own homes. Every user gets their own personal smart contract address for the dApp. So if they need to lock up any assets, they can lock them up in their personal smart contract address. This means they get to keep delegation control of their locked assets. But distributed dApps have a problem. How do users find each other? Concentrated dApps are used because when everything is located in the same address, it's easy to find everything you need. To solve this, I came up with beacon tokens. They are based on the fact that it is very easy to filter the current UTXO set for UTXOs that contain specific native assets. This means native assets can be used to tag UTXOs. It's just like tagging a document so that you can later filter your files by that tag. Beacon tokens are native assets whose main purpose is to tag UTXOs. Then, as long as everyone has the current UTXO set, they can filter it to find each other. Think about what this means. If all you need is the current UTXO set, distributed dApps are a lot like communications protocols. People just communicate through the blockchain. The UTXO set itself is essentially used like a public message board. Beacon tokens make it easy for users to find the messages relevant to them. In this slide, the ovals are UTXOs and the beacon tokens are the colors. You can very easily filter the message board to only see limit orders. So, since they only need the current UTXO set, in a sense, these distributed dApps are just extensions to a Cardano node. They add features directly into every Cardano wallet. Even light wallets can integrate them. We've now covered enough to talk about the P2P-DeFi protocols. They use the ideas we discussed to build a much better DeFi ecosystem for Cardano. Each protocol is designed to be the layer 1 for their respective markets. They use free markets to handle UTXO contention, and they are all distributed dApps. I call them protocols because, in my mind, they really are just messaging protocols. If the creators of Wi-Fi vanish tomorrow, your phones will still be able to connect to Wi-Fi. The same is true for these protocols. Here are the protocols. There are currently 4 in total. I've already mentioned the P2P order book protocol. In addition to supporting normal limit orders, it has a dedicated swap type that makes it easy for people to provide liquidity for 2-in-1 transactions. I call this new type of swap a liquidity swap. The next protocol is a credit market protocol. It supports negotiable loan terms, tradable bonds, and it uses beacon tokens to establish a trustless credit history. This is the first Cardano dApp to support a trustless credit history. We can't bank the unbanked without credit histories. The third protocol is an options trading protocol where every piece of the contract is customizable. And finally, the fourth protocol is an aftermarket protocol for reselling the bonds and options contracts. It is specifically designed for the credit market and options trading protocols, but it can theoretically be used as the secondary market for any financial NFT. The latter 3 protocols all rely on the order book for their liquidity needs. They expect people to use a 2-in-1 transaction whenever necessary. Because of this, even though in TradFi they are entirely separate markets, being able to compose them in the same transaction blurs the lines between each market. I actually don't know how big of an impact this will be, but it seems like a huge deal. Now, because the protocols are all meant to be the foundational layer for their DeFi markets, and they all work together, in my mind, they are just like the Linux kernel. They are the DeFi kernel. An entire ecosystem can be built around them. But these protocols will occasionally require changes, so how can they be updated? Upgrades for distributed dApps are entirely democratic in the exact same way as Cardano Node. Users must choose when and if to upgrade their addresses. And just like Cardano Node, versions are cross-compatible. So if some users are still using V1 while others are using V2, liquidity is never fractured. No governing DAO or multisig is ever needed. If any governance is necessary, Cardano's new government should handle it. What about funding? These protocols have 0 operating costs. They just involve filtering the current UTXO set, which can be done client-side by wallets. So they don't need continuous funding. Funding is really only required whenever upgrades are necessary. Upgrades to the DeFi kernel will likely be rare. Most upgrades to the Linux kernel involve changes that aren't relevant to smart contracts. And since businesses and blockchain layer 2s can supplement missing features and throughput, adding features and optimizations to the DeFi kernel should be a rare occurrence. As long as there are no bugs in the DeFi kernel, it can possibly go a few years without any upgrades. But still, how do we fund the upgrades? The funding model I am after is the Linux kernel model. Integrating and using the DeFi kernel is free. There are absolutely no licensing restrictions on how it can be used. Businesses and blockchain layer 2s that build on top of the DeFi kernel can sponsor a developer like myself to update the protocols when necessary. Another option is to have the Cardano Treasury fund some of it. The Treasury is meant to fund things like decentralized public utilities, and I think the DeFi kernel qualifies for this. I hope I've at least piqued your interest. Cardano's DeFi has so much untapped potential. We just need to stop shooting ourselves in the foot and be patient enough to let the ecosystem develop. Everyone keeps looking for shortcuts. The layering approach takes significantly longer to build out than the all-in-one approach. But as I explained in this presentation, it's worth the wait. You can learn more about what I'm building on my GitHub, Twitter, and YouTube channel. Just look for that profile picture. I open source everything and I try to write extensive documentation. The demo link is a demo of the desktop light wallet I built around these protocols. It's just a prototype, but it showcases how cheap and easy it is to use them. In order to support 2-in-1 transactions, I had to invent the first transaction cart for Cardano wallets. It's like an online shopping cart. You add each action to the cart and then execute them all together. And you aren't limited to just 2 actions. You can have as many as will fit in the transaction. The demo shows a transaction with 9 different actions, some for the DEX, some for the credit market, some for the options trading market, and even some personal stuff like changing your stake pool delegation. Despite all of this being in one transaction, the total transaction fee was 1.18. Seriously, there was 9 actions and you only paid 1.18. And this is with you keeping delegation control of your assets. Okay, that's the end of the presentation. We can spend the rest of the time on questions. I have prepared a few appendix slides just in case. So the question in the very beginning was like, what's the economic incentive for switching to P2P? Like, why are people currently using AMMs? In my opinion, they're just doing it wrong. Like the economic incentives actually strongly favor P2P. Like I said, there's 9 actions in this one transaction. The entire cost was 1.18. If you did the same thing with the current DeFi, you probably would have paid 30 ADA or more in fees.
To add to that, I think there's also just, right, when everyone thought of DeFi and blockchains, like we're going to do it completely different than the real world, like old. And then you're like, well, there are actually some good ideas for TradFi. They do some things really well. This layering approach has developed over many, many years and evolved to this point. And we should take the best parts of TradFi and combine them with the decentralized aspects too. So.
Mateusz, go ahead.
I have a few questions. Thank you for voice. So my question number 1, how are you financing yourself currently? How are you willing to finance yourself? You need to eat something. Are you taking part in the intersect groups or even raising donation token or anything? Basically, it's a full-time job, if only, probably more than full-time job. That's my first question. Actually, both of you, because we have 2 guests, right? The second question is related to how do we rally Cardano ecosystem towards this direction? Because based on your presentation, I'm really thinking like, why, for instance, AXO, just like an example, right? Why AXO went for the solution that they went for? Isn't it that there are basically these business reasons, like they try to prevent somebody else to steal their idea and stuff like that. It's like, it's socialism versus capitalism, right? It's like, here is some sort of DeFi kernel, everybody shares, right? But actually capitalism is not about sharing. It's about, I keep my own stuff, if you know what I'm trying to say as an analogy. I'm trying to understand. It's not just about mint swap. It's not about that we copied just EVM model, because this is what you said. I think we also have other people, right, like Genius Yield and AXO. They might have done it because of the business reasons, not because of the like the capitalistic reasons, rather than copying the EVM model. So I would like you, if you can comment on that a bit. And yeah, I think that's enough for the moment. Those 2 questions. Yeah.
So your questions are actually related. I'm going to answer the second one first and then go back to how I fund myself. You are right. It's completely capitalistic reasons. They release their yield tokens, like I think it's the Gen token for Genius Yield and the AXO token for AXO, but there's no actual value in those tokens. So what they're doing by closing off the order book, whenever the DEX has fees, they're trying to use the fees to prop up the value of their tokens. So they actually have an incentive to keep the order book closed because they're trying to prop up their tokens. They initially released the tokens because they wanted to get paid. I worked for free for the first 2 years, but then I applied for Catalyst funding for the 3rd year. But it's only an upfront cost for this stuff. Once it's done, it's like there's no operating cost to this. They just run as long as the Cardano blockchain runs. So it was really just an upfront cost. I did not want to do any yield tokens because they create toxic incentives. AXO and Genius are not going to open their order books, because if they did and a business interacts with the order books directly, they have no incentive to use those fees to prop up the AXO token. So that answers the second question. As for how I funded myself, like I said, I worked pro bono for the first 2 years, then Catalyst for the second. my time horizon is longer, where I actually want to build a business on top. I want to build an arbitrage bot, and I actually want to be a lender for the credit market. So if I built a revenue backdoor for myself into these protocols, it would make them worse. Part of the reason why they're 10 times to 100 times cheaper than the current DeFi dApps is because there's no DAO fees, no pool fees, and no batcher fees. It's just the transaction fee. So that it would have made them worse. If Linus had charged for his Linux kernel, it never would have gotten adopted. So that's how I plan to fund myself going forward, is to build businesses on top.
Thank
And-
you. We have a few more questions. Perry, or go ahead, Perry.
I was just gonna say, like, I do think there's capitalism is still very synergistic, right? You have market makers, you have brokers, right? You have Ameritrade, you have the DTCC. These are all individual. No one's trying to be, every DEX these days is trying to be their own Dow Jones, their own Jane Street, their own Ameritrade, which is crazy and inefficient, right? Markets haven't developed this way. We're just deciding to do it this way. This is not actually how capitalism works. I think it's the really key thing to say.
That's a great point. Thank you. Heinrich, you're next. Go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you for starting this. Just on the funding part, one idea that I learned recently is, not sure if it's applicable here, but I wanted to mention it. Since you compete, or this kernel will then compete with existing DEXs who have a token which has a price in which they want to prop up. One way of so you're trying to beat the competition. One way of going about it is assuming that this kernel will beat them, is to short the other tokens. That would give you some extra money to do the development. I don't know whether this is going to work, but I do want to mention the possibility. I think this is what I learned from this new Chinese AI, which was essentially invented by a hedge firm who shorted and the American AI companies further, and that's how they got their development money for DeepSec. Just throwing it out. Yeah, no financial advice. Just wanted to mention.
That is definitely one option. I think I would rather try to be more collaborative with them. Like, one of the things that they can do to prop up their tokens is pivot to be actual market makers for the new order book. If they try to compete head to head, they're going to lose. Like, it's just 10 times to 100 times cheaper to use the actual order book. So if they pivot to be real market makers, they can split the market making profit with all of their token holders. I think that's a much better long-term plan for them. And it also creates more demand for my arbitrage bot and the stuff that I want to build on top.
Fair enough.
Great idea, Heinrich. Inicio, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Nicholas. Guys, I really love this presentation, and I do believe that you guys absolutely qualify for, let's say, we have this developer blog within the Cardano Foundation. And what the blog basically does, it's a blog style interview that we use to introduce ecosystem projects to the Cardano ecosystem. It's not about promoting a project. It's really educational. And I'd love to reconnect with someone from your team to learn a bit more about what you guys are doing, so that we can really come up with some really good, engaging, and interesting questions that would help the ecosystem understand who you are, what you're developing, and what it really, let's say, has to bring to the ecosystem. Now, fallen-icarus, I just sent you a message on X. So just in case you are wondering, who's that guy? That's me. So
Okay.
I'd love to connect with you and just explore what's possible. That's all.
Sounds good.
And
Thanks,
just
Nicholas.
quickly to respect Rusty, Jerry, and Perry's time, do you still have time for 2 questions? We're already at the hour.
I do, yes. I don't know if Perry or Jerry can stay.
I think one thing, I'll just make this very brief. What we are doing today and how are we trying to drive growth? We are talking with wallets. Wallets in our minds are brokers. We have Giro, we have Begin, they're interested. Any help though with creating, what easy way for wallets to integrate this is helpful. We are also starting to talk to existing, we already got the introduction to existing bot platforms, right? This overall mimics like intent agent type of architectures you might see in other places. So we need bots that are out there doing arbitrage. And so we've talked to the Talos, but we are working for help ecosystem collaboration. We can't build this all ourselves. So that's all I'll say before we lose people.
No, thank you so much. Mathieu, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to add something else that wasn't really mentioned, but is a big advantage of Cardano's model transaction. So you guys mentioned the fact that we can have 2-in-1 transactions, and you guys mentioned that the fact that market making is actually competitive and anyone can participate in market making. I will add that thanks to Cardano models, transactions are instantaneous, meaning in other blockchains, you hear sometimes of flash loan, something like that, that people borrow temporarily money to make a transaction, then do another thing with the things they are borrow, and then at the end, they reimburse the money. In Cardano models of transactions, you don't even have to do that. So if there is a negative spread on an amount that is in the millions of ADA of USD, even if you don't have the millions, you can make the trades with the negative trades by using the liquidity that are in the UTXOs that you are using to fill the transaction, which means it's even more competitive and even more efficient to do market making on Cardano than on other blockchains because of this instantaneous combination of transactions.
Yep, it's definitely democratized. The layer 2 competition, the competition on layer 1, it's all, you don't actually need millions of dollars to start up. You could start up with like $1,000. That's actually how I intend to start my arbitrage bot. So
Nice, great question, Mathieu, and great comment actually. And now for the last question, Mateusz, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Matthew, for these insights. I wish more market makers actually use Cardano, but somehow they don't. Which actually brings me to, I think your idea for spreading this is very good. We need to go to the wallets, basically, to spread it. Because sometimes the idea might be brilliant, but it doesn't have adoption, right? And we see this in Ethereum, we see this in Cardano. Axo is not as successful, not because it's so great, but because MintSwap had a first mover advantage in these types of things. So unfortunately, not always the best ideas win. But I actually have my question is, because that was statements, right? My question is related to the kernel itself, the P2P-DeFi kernel. Would you say at this stage, as a creator and an architect behind it, that this has been completed, or it requires at least version 1.0, or would you say that it still requires a few polishing here or there in order to claim 1.0 tag, whatever, yeah.
So of the 4 protocols, I'm going to talk about them individually. The Cardano swaps, which is the DEX protocol, in my mind, it's done. It's waiting for the audit to finish, which should ideally be about April. Then the credit market protocol is also done. That's also currently in the process of being audited. The options trading one, I think there's actually room for improvement on using free markets for UTXO contention there. So personally, I think there's room for improvement there. The secondary market also has some room for improvement. Currently, it's a general purpose secondary market, so it's meant for all possible financial entities. It might actually be better to make a specialized secondary market for each protocol. So like the credit market would get its own dedicated aftermarket protocol, and then the options too. So to get this started though, we only need the DEX and the credit market. By like those two make up the lion's share of all economic activity. It's always exchanging assets and then borrowing money to start businesses. The options trading and the aftermarket are kind of like icings on the cake. So in my mind, it's done enough to actually start adoption, while like ideally there'd be other people helping to brainstorm like how to improve the other ones. So I'd say Cardano swaps and Cardano credit market are at V1. The other two are close, but not there entirely.
Fantastic. All right. And I think that's it with the questions. Maybe before we end, Rusty, where can people find out more? You posted all of the links. I guess this is where they should look, but maybe where can people help find out more and do all these kind of things?
I think the best place is probably the GitHub if you want the actual technical side of it. Like you got the specification there, but you also have some high level discussions within the READMEs. On my X account, I only really post about this stuff. So I actually haven't posted that much, so you could go back and see. The same thing with the YouTube channel. It is dedicated to this stuff. There are tutorials for the demo wallet, and there are a couple of explainer videos. So you could always reach out and on one of those channels.
We can also send an email after this with just all the links together. We definitely want to try to probably bring this together in a better way for people to understand, but we can get this all together. It's going to be shared at least internally.
Yeah, perfect. Send it to me and I can just forward it. And with that, I just want to say thank you, Rusty, Jerry, and Perry, for sharing more about P2P DeFi. I learned a lot, and I'm sure many of my colleagues as well. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy day. And
I would like to ask one question to anybody. Did this change your perspective on Cardano's DeFi? Can you give a thumbs up if it changed your perspective? Okay, cool.
I
Explosions of
Reason
thumbs.
why we need to that blog.
I thought that this was common practice already. I was surprised to hear that it's not. So-
Yes, that's